Trigger warning. This story contains scenes of emotional abuse, coercion, and physical injury. Please take care while listening. He said the wrong name, and the room tilted. Luna had rehearsed the moment for months. No, for 5 years. She had imagined the quiet way Jasper would catch her hand, the way the chandeliers would throw soft light on her father's shoulders, the hush that would fold itself into 1,000 cameras and the faces that mattered most. She had imagined vows like a promise she could carry. Instead, Jasper smiled into the microphone, slow and practiced, and said, "I promise to love you, Chloe." The bouquet slipped from Luna's fingers. For an instant, the petals hung in the air, impossible, as if the entire hall had stopped, waiting for a correction. Jasper's voice curdled in that moment. There was a visible hitch, and then everyone in the room turned. A chair scraped. Someone laughed too loudly. The officiant's pen scratched across a page as if it mattered. Luna felt the heat at her face, an acute, animal shame that came before thought. She watched people lean forward like a chorus, mouths forming questions, eyes sharpening. Mrs. Harris's smile landed like a blade. Cameras clicked. Her father, Mr. Ford, went very still, like a man in a painting. Leo's jaw clenched in the second row, then softened when he saw how small it made her look. Chloe, who had slipped in at the last minute, who everyone said had no business in their world, stood framed in the doorway, palms damp, eyes wide. For everyone else, it was a scandal. For Luna, it was the moment where memory became slippery. She could not name the sensation then. Later, it would be called dissociation, a break, something the doctors labeled with technical soft words that made it seem tidy. In the wedding hall, it was only noise, a ringing in the ears, the chandelier spinning, and a hollow in the place where years lived. "Chloe?" someone murmured. Then louder, "Are you—" "Jasper," Luna heard herself say, and the sound made her hands numb. She had been looking at him for years. She thought she knew every island of his face. In that breath, she reached for some proof inside herself and felt nothing. There was a dark, clean gap, like someone had erased a page. She stood because she was supposed to. She walked down the aisle because people were watching. Her legs felt wrong, as if she were wearing someone else's skin. Jasper's hand brushed hers when he took the ring. His touch was familiar and vague all at once, like a song you've heard but can't place. He looked at her with that professorial intensity he used when he meant to teach her a lesson. He kissed her cheek in front of the witnesses and said, "Everything's fine." His voice was a promise and a warning. Later, when the photos circulated, still frames where her eyes were pools, where the bouquet was an explosion of white, someone would edit time and make the wrong name into a premeditated smear. But at the moment, the hall erupted into 1,000 small disasters, whispers, accusations, the thin metallic taste of embarrassment. Luna's world contracted to the sound of her own breath. They took her to the small room backstage at the hall first, then to a car, and then to the hospital, all in compressed, fragmentary seconds. Her mother held her hand so tightly she thought she might crush the bones. Mr. Ford's eyes were rimmed with an exhaustion so old it predated his own face. Her brother Ethan was not there yet. He had been at the plant and would call in an hour with his voice thin and alarmed, but that came later. In the emergency corridor, lights buzzed with a fluorescent insistence. Doctors spoke with careful terms that pared her life down to symptoms. Retrograde amnesia, someone said, shock response. "She fainted," Jasper told the doctor. His voice was steady, surgical. When he turned to her, his gaze slid, measured, as if he were calculating a margin. "Luna, do you remember anything?" Her answer was a silence so complete it felt like a new language. She could not remember the way Jasper tasted in the small, intimate moments, or the way his hand had found her waist in a car when she thought no one was watching. She could not remember the apartment they shared, a place filled with books and a small battered model airplane. Though a tiny scrap of sensation clung to her, the smell of citrus from a shaving soap she once hated, and the soft scrap of linen that had been her most comfortable shirt. Names are anchors, her mother said later, in the waiting room, as if announcing an obscure truth. She smoothed the hem of Luna's wedding dress like one would smooth a map. But what if the map is burned? Luna asked, because bitterness rose up at the edges of her voice. She could not identify the feeling properly. Anger tasted like metal. Grief was a wash she had not learned to swim in. Leo arrived with a face that had strained its muscles into the expression he'd been practicing all week. Trust me. He moved with the underdog's urgent calm. He carried a worn leather satchel and an airplane pen on his lapel that he pushed up between two fingers when he spoke to her. He had not expected to be at the wedding that night, not in the way he was. He had been asked to attend as a courtesy and had declined until the minute his mother ambled him away and placed him in the car. He had told himself he would be a quiet witness. He had not imagined being pulled into this. "Hey," he said, lower than the rest of the world, kneeling by her bed. "Hey, Luna, it's me, Leo." She looked at him like someone trying to read a language written in an unfamiliar script. She liked the sound of his voice. She liked the steadiness it promised. But she could not summon the private memory of nights where he'd waited outside her apartment in the rain, or the touch of his hand at parties, gestures that he remembered and she did not. "You don't have to answer," he said, as if offering her a refuge. "Just breathe." At the hospital, the phones were small explosions of gossip. Jasper's phone never stopped ringing. Men with polite but insistent voices checked in from the office. There were messages from lawyers tightening around words, offers of statements, rehearsed lines to hold as shields. Mr. Harris, Jasper's father, sent a private condolence with an undercurrent of calculation that made Mr. Ford's jaw clench. The press had begun to circulate doctored snippets. Politicians and small-time socialites called with the kind of curiosity that smelled like vultures. Chloe hovered at the edges of the storm. She was small and fierce in a way that made people misunderstand her. She had been a driver's daughter once, and that fact clung to her like oil. At the hall, she had worn a dress that tried too hard and clung to her like an apology. Her eyes never met Luna's directly. When a reporter pushed a microphone toward her, she folded inward, gave a rote statement about being devastated, and then slipped away. Some people whispered of an affair. Others rolled their eyes and chose the gossip that tasted best. Chloe's own hand trembled when she removed the ring that was not a wedding band, but a threadbare thing she'd been given by someone else years ago. "People will write what they want," Jasper said once to Luna in a room with too many curtains and the smell of expensive coffee. His hand found the small of her back in a move that used to make her feel protected. This time it brushed like a stranger. "They will interpret what's convenient." "You called me another woman's name," Luna said. The words were brittle. She did not feel the weight of all 5 years. She felt only the hollow of them, as if someone had scooped them out and left crumbs. "It was a mistake," he said, and there was a tautness there that suggested a different kind of truth. "A slip. Public nerves. You know how my speech trembles at times." "All my friends are on their phones," she said, because the humiliation had taken a place inside her that was ugly and loud. "They will remember the slip." "They will see the rest," he replied. "They will see the vows. They will see us." But his promise sounded like a ledger entry, not a vow. And Luna, who had once traded certainty for audible proof, letters, photographs, receipts of affection, found that after the wrong name, there was a ledger with blank pages. News of Ethan came like a second blow. He was at the Ford manufacturing plant when a machine stuck and an alarm set off a chain of errors. The call came while Luna was still in a sterile consultation room, the ring slicing through the quiet like a small knife. Her brother's voice on the other end was distant, breathless. "Ethan's at Mercy," her mother said later, voice compressed like paper. They rushed. The world between the hospital and the plant was a compressed film of lights. Luna watched the city blur by window glass. Her mother clasped her hand like a prayer. Leo drove. Jasper was in the back, speaking into his phone with decisive words. Arrange everything. No one leaks. I want control. When they reached Mercy Hospital, Ethan lay with his head bandaged, the color sucked out of his face. Machines kept time with an indifferent rhythm. Doctors said stable and critical with the same flatness. The family gathered, faces like a collection of things found in a drawer. Mr. Ford's stillness, Mrs. Ford's hands, Ethan's soot-streaked shirt. Luna's inability to remember 5 years felt like an insult to all of them. How could a piece of her vanish when they were supposed to be whole? Between the two emergencies, between the wrong name and a brother's life bleeding out, Luna had to make tiny decisions. Who had access to bank accounts? Who would manage the company's public statement? Which friends were permitted to visit? Each small choice was a stitch in a larger seam that might or might not hold. Jasper suggested they accept help. He spoke as if offering salvation. My father will step in, he said quietly to Luna when they found a corner away from reporters and gurneys. A bridge loan, $50 million. It will all be handled. Your father's company won't take a hit. Luna heard the number like another language. $50 million could save factories, pay down debts, buy stability that smells like detergent and fertilizer and payrolls met. It could steady the hands of people who had worked their whole lives. It could also be a cage. What do you want in return? She asked, because men who handed over money always expected currency back. They always did. He lifted a single shoulder, the mannerism of a man who never spoke plainly if he could avoid it. Nothing you wouldn't have wanted otherwise, he said. His smile held something brittle. We should formalize everything, for your parents' sake. Formalize how? Her voice was small in the antiseptic corridor. An agreement, he said. Signatures, conditions tied to the investment, standard protections. It was never a casual offer. Money handed with strings had a way of tightening itself until it was indistinguishable from ownership. Rumors crackled through the city like static. A paparazzo at the plant took a photo of Chloe entering the Mercy emergency wing and sold it to a tabloid. The caption read something whispery and false. A voice memo surfaced the next day. Short, clipped, a piece of a conversation recorded on a phone. Jasper's laugh, a phrase misquoted, then a cut. People began to choose which part of the story fit best into the life they wanted to believe. This is when families fracture, Mr. Ford said one night, standing on the balcony of the hospital with his hands buried in his pockets. When money meets pride. Luna watched him, feeling like a child who had overheard a lecture in which she had no stake in. There were other pressures. Leo's parents called them in the quiet hours and asked what his intentions were. They feared the snare of scandal. They feared Leo being hurt. Mrs. Bennet was practical in a soft way. We will protect our son. Do not let him be a pawn. Leo, when left alone with Luna, did not speak in strategic phrases. He brought the airplane model, a small token he'd once given her when the city felt heavy, wrapped in tissue. He placed it on her nightstand. I thought you might like to keep this, he said, as if an airplane in the corner of a hospital room could be a lighthouse. She held it and found that the little wings warmed with her palm. The toy smelled faintly of glue and old sun, a scent that tugged at something behind her ribs. In the empty hours, he told stories about his father teaching him to fix radios, about the small pleasures of sandwiches made at midnight, things that were not dramatic but had weight because they were ordinary. When he spoke, he made the world less like a courtroom and more like a place where one might belong. Jasper watched them sometimes, from across a room or through a doorway. When he smiled at Leo in public, it was a predatory politeness, the kind of smile that measured angles and profit margins instead of emotions. He would offer Luna shelter and then position himself where she could not easily escape his gaze. He would say, "We will get through this," and the sentence landed like an obligation. The lawyers came with their clipboards and legalese. There were NDAs drafted in the same office where Jasper gave orders about acquisitions. The language was clean. Confidentiality, liquidated damages, non-disparagement. The Ford family read the contracts in a room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. They looked at Luna like she might sign away a piece of herself for the promise of the company's survival. "You don't need to decide now," her mother told her, in a voice that tried to be both gentle and pragmatic. "We need to fight for Ethan. We need to keep the company from collapsing." But Luna was asked to decide now because the world had no patience for pauses. Her memory was a chasm that had left her unreliable to everyone who needed her in one piece. Jasper's offer hung like a halo and a noose. In the middle of this, physical violence intruded in the way the city sometimes does. Men in dark coats, the quiet enforcement of power, moments designed to intimidate rather than injure. Luna woke one night to a pain in her leg, sharp, humiliating, and the flash of a single heavy weight, a fall, the sound of something splitting. There was a hospital bed and a cast. The doctor said a fracture and accident. There were too many hands touching her as if she were something breakable. The bruise healed, the memory did not. Jasper's people moved quickly. They denied, deflected, built alibis and narratives. They fed selected reporters a version of events where Chloe was an opportunist, where Luna's fainting at the altar was an overeager attention ploy. They sent their lawyers to the Fords with pleasant smiles and firm paperwork. An investment, they said, is an investment. Let us help. Chloe's motives remained a blur. Sometimes Luna would catch Chloe staring. No pity, no triumph, only something raw and guarded. Once, Chloe slipped a small envelope into Luna's hand, and when Luna asked what it was, Chloe only shook her head and walked away. The envelope held nothing but a faded photograph. Luna laughing in a cafe with a man whose back was turned. It meant nothing and everything. There were nights when Luna lay awake and tried to feel for the 5 years. Sometimes she could pull up a single image with the precision of a needle. Jasper laughing in the rain, his hand covered in oil from a car he'd fixed for her as a joke. A birthday cake with too many candles. A phone conversation that echoed, "We can fix this." And between those flashes was an ocean she could not cross. Each image felt like a half-truth, suspicious of its own honesty. She had been trained to trust evidence, truths told by receipts, meeting notes, contracts. But memory was not a ledger. It was a living thing that refused to be written down neatly. People began to argue about whether her blankness could be exploited. "If she can't remember consent," one of Jasper's associates said in a voice meant to be confidential, "then legally we have an opening." The sentence landed like an accusation, and Luna felt, for a moment, like a commodity priced by lawyers. She recoiled. "I am not a ledger," she wanted to say, but the words would not come with force. At a private meeting in Mr. Harris's office, glass walls, a view of the city like a painting, Jasper unfolded the terms. 40 to 50 million, he said, precise as ever, will help Ford Manufacturing maintain operations. In exchange, we formalize certain protections, public statements, joint oversight committees, and, for administrative clarity, a clause that discusses the personal circumstances of the primary shareholders' family. Administrative clarity, Mr. Ford echoed, his voice rough. He looked like a man staring at a ledger that had eaten years of his life. "You mean control." "It's a partnership," Jasper corrected, "protection." Leo listened from the doorway, hands stuffed in his pockets like a boy he had once been. He had come into the meeting because he could not bear the thought of the Fords being swallowed alive. He had no illusions about how the game was played. He watched Luna watch her father, and the contraction of her face told him more than any statement. She was frightened, yes, but she was also like iron melting in hot water, malleable but not without structure. "You want us to sign a lot of things," Luna said finally, because silence had been filling the room with assumptions. "Standard corporate documents," Jasper said. He placed a sleek folder on the glass table, the paper inside crisp and implacable. We protect your family. You preserve your dignity. It is simple. Luna, you don't have to, her mother began. This is about saving jobs, Mr. Ford interrupted, and his voice carried the tired righteousness of a man who believed his life should matter in practical terms. If this keeps the plant open, then we must consider it. Luna looked at the folder as if it were a map to a place she might never want to go. And yet, the outline of a life without $20, $30, $50 million was frightening in its own way. The plant workers' faces taped to the factory wall, men who had been there for decades, haunted her. She had to choose between a public humiliation that had already burned her name and the future of people who had counted on her family. Jasper watched her with a face that was both pleading and strategic. "We will help," he said again. "We will be merciful." Outside, the city moved on like nothing had happened. Taxis honked, a vendor sold roasted chestnuts on a corner. In the small hospital room, the airplane model sat on a nightstand, like a talisman. Leo traced its tiny wings with a fingertip and then reached across the bed to cover Luna's hand with his. "No one can name you but you," he said softly. And for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that little sentence. Luna closed her eyes. The idea floated, a possibility and a threat. To choose Jasper's help meant binding a part of the family's fate to a man who had just called her by another name in public. To refuse could mean watching the factories go dark and the paycheck stop. To wait was not an option because the world demanded currency now. Paper slid across the glass table. A pen lay invitingly on the top. The folder held an outline of conditions. Somewhere in the building, a clock ticked audibly. "Sign," Jasper said once, as if that single syllable were the best kindness he could offer. Luna put her palm down next to the pen and felt the slow tremor of her pulse. She felt the weight of 5 years pressing like a question she could not answer. She remembered the airplane model's wings under her fingers and the soft voice of a man who had practiced steadfastness. She did not sign yet, but she kept her hand on the paper, a small, deliberate hold that meant she understood the shape of the choice. That night, when the city cooled and lights blinked like distant constellations, Luna lay awake and thought of names. She thought of Chloe, who'd been a stranger and perhaps not. She thought of Leo's soft insistence. She thought of Jasper's practiced gentleness, which sometimes looked a lot like ownership. She thought of the men who walked in black coats and left impressions on her like bruises. She thought of the ache behind her left knee where the cast would go. Each time Luna sat by his bed and watched him sleep, she felt the cost of every choice tighten around her ribs. Leo was there as often as he could be. He brought sandwiches that tasted like childhood, and he brought a steadiness that did not clamor for attention. He did not promise grand gestures. He offered seated presence. He taught Luna to breathe through the fog of missed memories by narrating small, ordinary histories. What he'd eaten that day, which bus had come late, how he'd once broken the spring on an old clock and cursed himself into patience while mending it. Those stories were the scaffolding that let her lean without crumbling. Jasper's presence was a different pressure, formal, strategic, and always arranged so that she could not mistake the intention. He sat in meetings with Mr. Ford as if they were in a courtroom of commerce. His tone was gentler in the private moments but colder in the edges. He found ways to insert himself between Luna and the people who might have been anchors. Trusted lawyers, old friends, the woman from the accounts department who had once caught Luna crying over spreadsheets. He offered help with paperwork, with hospital bills, with the logistics of running a family company from a place where one of its central figures could not recall 5 years of being present. "You need to move quickly," he said once, sliding a legal brief across a table. The paper smelled of a different life. Paperbacks, ink, decisions made by men who tended to things like margins and lost time. If there's any room for ambiguous interpretations, we tighten it. We make the facts clear. Who decides what's clear? She asked, because the question had become more than rhetorical. We do, he answered. He said it like the most reasonable thing in the world. Meanwhile, the city's appetite for gossip produced new predators. Anonymous blogs pieced the wedding moment into chapters of scandal. One outlet ran a headline suggesting infidelity, and another printed a timeline that rearranged facts until the narrative fit neatly under a banner of moral failure. The people who wrote columns did not have the language of tenderness. They had the language of clicks and outrage. And when facts were inconvenient, they blurred them until the blur looked like truth. Chloe, predictably, refused to be satisfactorily simple. She lauded the minimal statements reporters demanded and then retreated into shadows. But some nights she would appear in the hospital cafe, her hands around the paper cup, looking tired in a way that was not performance. Once, out of nowhere, she showed Luna a new photo, a phone shot of a dim hallway and the back of a man in a suit, his head turned toward a door labeled service. The caption Chloe gave it was nothing more than a date and a short line, night before wedding. When Luna looked at it, something, a small filament of recognition, shivered in her. "You took this?" Luna asked. Chloe swallowed. "I was where I shouldn't have been. I shouldn't have wanted to hear, but I heard something, I put it on the cloud without thinking." "Who is he?" Luna pressed. Chloe's jaw tightened. "Someone from Jasper's office. I thought—" She stopped and then, abruptly, went quiet, as if she had given away too much. "I thought it might save me." She had been used before, Luna learned. The daughter of a driver with a quarter of a world known and the rest of it sold. Doors opened for Chloe in the smallest ways and closed in others. Jasper's circle had found her company convenient at times and cruel at others. Luna's sympathy for her was complicated by cogs of anger she could not quite place. The world loved tidy villains, and Chloe refused to fit. Leo found a way into an office he was always told he did not belong in. He was practical in his methods. He had a cousin who worked in digital forensics, and a slow, persistent manner when the answer demanded digging rather than a quick headline. He met with the cousin in a strip-lit room stacked with servers and the smell of cold metal. There they found breadcrumbs, time-stamped transfers of files, anonymous uploads, and a file folder that had been scrubbed and then clumsily rebuilt. Somewhere inside the rubble of code was an original audio file, raw, unedited, that had been clipped and thrown into social feeds as a weapon. It took them 2 days and a quiet night of coffee to get it playable. The audio was grainy and long. In the middle of a prepared speech, Jasper's voice was there, clearer than in the cut versions, saying a name that contained the smallest of mercies. It was not a slip of the tongue as the tabloids had framed it. His tone turned then to a laugh, low and practiced, and another voice answered with a dry managerial comment. A second later, there was a sound like a pocket closing, a small click, an engineer's edit cue, and the raw fabric of bravado resumed. The file held more, plan speak, a call about a public moment, and how the optics would force them to be realistic. The language was not explicit about the intent to cause Luna harm, but it suggested that the wedding moment had been anticipated and curated, an image to be leveraged. Leo, hands trembling, closed his eyes for a second. "This is it," he said. "This is what they used." Luna listened in the next room. She was simultaneously armored and raw. The audio did not bring back 5 years. It did not reconstruct the intimacy of private nights. But it did anchor an idea. The wrong name was not an innocent slip. Someone had planned for people to look in a certain direction, and while they did, other things could be arranged. Armed with the file, they had to decide how to use it. Play it publicly and risk a legal battle they might not win? Hand it to a lawyer and risk it being buried? Jasper's machine would prepare for both. His men shielded him with contracts and threats that were quiet and accurate. They chose to test it first. Leo's cousin ran the audio through enhancements, carving noise away, widening frequencies until Jasper's voice sat on the top like a coin. It was clearer, but also fragile. Anyone could claim tampering. Proof needed context beyond a couple of seconds of sound. They sought Chloe next. She was tense but cooperative. "I recorded a hallway because I was suspicious," she said, voice low. "Then I uploaded it and later there were edits. I think someone at Jasper's firm downloaded it. I don't know why. I don't know what they used it for." Chloe's confession did not clear her. Instead, it made her position more precarious. She had been in other rooms, seen other small arrangements. She knew names and schedules and had once been paid to keep quiet. That knowledge had made her an attractor for both shame and leverage. Now she could be useful, but that usefulness made her a target. "Help me," Chloe told Luna once, hands twisting the hem of a hospital blanket. "Help me make it matter so I'm not the only one who loses everything." Luna's instinct did not immediately bend toward mercy. She had reasons to distrust Chloe. But there was also an honesty in the woman's voice that had nothing to do with the gossip. She had not asked to be named in public. She had been dragged into the spotlight and then tossed aside. If Chloe could help prove that the wedding incident had been engineered, perhaps the leverage could be undone. They plotted cautiously. Leo and his cousin built a timeline of the day. Timestamps, the movement of cameras, the people who entered service corridors. They identified a night shift security guard who had always breathed too loud when nervous, and who had been recorded on a security camera moving a service cart down the hall at precisely the wrong time. They found a digital trail to a third-party vendor that provided sound tech for events, and that vendor's invoice had been quietly paid by a shell company linked in the public ledger to Jasper's office. The more they pulled, the more Jasper's financial silk showed its threads. It did not imply a criminal syndicate in the cinematic sense the tabloids love to fantasize about. Rather, it revealed a meticulous, extra-legal infrastructure, hired hands for intimidation, shell companies for PR manipulations, lawyers who never quite put all their names on paper. It was the work of a man who had learned how to make influence look inevitable. When Luna confronted him with the idea of evidence, he did not explode. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded as if in a lesson. "Prove it," he said. "You think I'm going to be impressed by hearsay and paparazzi? Show me something real." They had, but real evidence had to be credible in court, not merely combustible in a newsroom. So they found another track, human testimony. They spoke with a tech who had been contracted to do sound checks and who remembered a conversation with a junior associate, someone who had been nervous enough to leave a voice message about the public moment. He wanted out now. He hated the moral rot. He had kept a copy. He admitted, hands shaking, that he'd been paid and then paid again to erase the payment trail. He had been scared. He would testify. Jasper's reaction when this man spoke was a model of controlled fury. He sat at the head of a long table while the staff around him shifted like a flock. "You have no idea what you're doing," he murmured to the tech in the presence of the speaker. "You've already signed indemnities." The tech's statement was a small victory, but victories in court are measured in inches. More pressing for Luna was that the stress of the fight tightened around her in other ways. She had nights where shards of memory appeared like intrusive adverts, a laugh that was not commitment, a hand brushed too firmly over a shoulder, the memory of a hallway with fluorescent lights, and the smell of someone's cologne that she could not place. Therapy helped in a disjointed, halting way. She met with Dr. Jason Vale, a hypnotherapist who offered a gentle, practical way to access the fog. He did not promise miracles. He explained the mechanics: dissociative amnesia as the brain's defense against traumatic overload, the possibility of partial recovery through sensory anchors, and scheduled sessions. "Memory is not a videotape," Jason said on the first day, voice steady, neutral. "It's associative. Smells, sounds, textures, those can unlock pathways without forcing you into a painful retrieval. We will go slowly." The first sessions were a mixture of ache and small success. They probed with small things. the airplane model, the scent of citrus soap, the sound of a particular chord from a song that had been in the background of one night. Luna's response was not immediate catharsis. It was coughs of recall and the slow surfacing of detail. She remembered a corridor with a metal handrail and, more disturbingly, a figure in the dark beyond the threshold that made her stomach clench. She remembered a heavy weight hitting the back of her calf and a sudden, hot bloom of pain. She recalled the sound of someone telling her to be quiet in a voice that commanded obedience. These partial recoveries were maps dotted with blanks. They were useful in court in the way that the majority of small details can be, if corroborated. They provided the narrative skeleton that Leo's forensics and Chloe's photos could put flesh around. The fracture in her leg, once explained as an accident, gained a sharper edge. Within the composite of memories and testimonies, it fit onto a night when a car ride had been rerouted and a supposed accident had been staged. The driver recalled swerving because something had fallen from the glove box. A repair bill for the car showed no external damage. Small things that once looked accidental now gathered into a suspicious pattern. When Jasper caught wind of the hypnotherapy and the new corroborating evidence, his public face shifted. At press events, he was contrite. "I am devastated by what Luna has suffered," he told cameras with a practiced sorrow. But his private interactions were colder, laced with threats disguised as pragmatism. Lawyers spoke of stability clauses, of non-disparagement that would silence uncomfortable questions. His power was both the safety net he offered and the noose he dangled. Luna made a choice in one of those sessions with Jason that would define her next move. She would not be a vessel for other people's decisions. The therapy sessions offered her a taste of the autonomy she had lost. Each recovered fragment was both a wound and a tool. "You will have to be brave," Jason said gently in one session. "Recovery doesn't make the past safe, it makes it known." "I don't know if I want the past to be known," she answered honestly. "Knowledge can be a kind of ownership too. I don't want to be owned by what I remember." "You get to decide what to do with it," he replied. "That is the important part." Armed with partial memory, the raw audio, and testimony from the tech, they planned a public push timed to a shareholders meeting where Jasper's firm would be present. The plan was simple in design and complicated in execution. Play the raw, unedited audio, present witnesses who would corroborate the pattern of manipulation, and hold the firm to account for any conditional language in the proposed investment. They would force the conversation into the light. On the morning of the meeting, the shareholders' room hummed with a low conviction of self-importance. Cameras were allowed in. Jasper's people had cleared the optics, expecting an easy victory. Mr. Harris, Jasper's father, sat with a face like a portrait cut out of winter. Mr. Ford arrived stoic, the lines of his face carved deeper by the weight of the plant and the fight to keep it alive. Leo and a nervous team of supporters filed in, carrying folder after folder. Chloe sat 2 rows behind Luna, hands in her lap, looking smaller than anyone expected. The tech who had confessed showed up, pale but resolute. A lawyer from Leo's side, quiet, precise, not the kind who used his voice as armor, handed a copy of the raw audio to the meeting moderator, with the polite stare of someone who knew papers had power. When the audio played, it filled the room with the flat truth of sound. Jasper's voice was there, patient, practiced, and then the exchange that had been clipped for public consumption. The room breathed out in noises that were half discomfort and half calculation. For once, the polished man of power could not smooth over the crack. Jasper's reaction was a slow process. He controlled his features for a while, the tight smile of someone who had been practiced in public emotion. He objected, of course. The lawyers protested chain of custody. He suggested tampering, a common defense. But the tech's testimony and the tracking of invoices stitched the possibility of truth into a pattern the shareholders could not easily ignore. The boardroom, built for decisions of profit, does not always move easily into moral clarity. Yet, when money and risk intersect, even a board of directors must account for reputational damage. Someone on Jasper's side made a move, an attempt to play a private clip that showed Luna's fainting as purely a dramatic play. The moderator, however, leaned on corporate due diligence. An internal compliance officer, whose interest in truth was unsettlingly neutral, flagged the shell companies and the payments routed through them. It was not a criminal trial, but reputational consequences were immediate and practical. Legal counsel advised against proceeding toward acquisition under conditions that hinged on forced personal concessions. The shareholders murmured. Mr. Ford spoke like a man who had spent his life believing he would not be defined by rumor. He stood and said plainly, "We will not allow my daughter's name to be bargaining currency in a deal that keeps our people employed." The room's tide shifted. Jasper's confident plan was encountering the friction of other people's conscience and the stark, practical reality that collusion leaves traces. He had relied on subtlety and the inertia of power, but evidence, even partial, had momentum. After the meeting, behind closed doors and under the hum of fluorescent lights, Jasper faced Luna in the corridor. He was quiet in a way that made anger look like a slow animal. "You made this personal," he said. The words were small and sharp. "You are making it harder for everyone." "I made it personal because it was made personal for me," Luna answered. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Each sentence had cost her. "You turned my life into leverage." He inhaled. For a moment, he looked like a man seeing himself reflected back as someone he didn't recognize. "We can adjust the terms," he offered, calculating. "We can remove personal clauses. We will be generous if you help us keep this quiet." "I won't help you keep this quiet," she said. "I will not be your instrument." He reached forward, not to touch, but as if to close distance. "Think about the plant," he said. "Think about Ethan. There are people whose lives depend on this." "I am thinking about them," she replied, "which is why I refuse to sign away my dignity for the promise of their paychecks." The corridor felt small, full of too many steps that led to other decisions. Jasper's suit was impeccable. His face, close, looked like a ledger that rarely showed emotion. The people who had chosen such men as leaders often did so because men like Jasper made difficult choices look surgical and inevitable. Luna's refusal to play along changed that narrative. It forced a tactile hesitation into what Jasper had designed to be a smooth operation. He left without further pressure. That night, in the small safety of a borrowed apartment, Luna slept deeply for the first time in days. Her dreams were jagged, but they were her own. The following weeks saw a slow unspooling of authority. Legal teams negotiated the investment with a new letter of scrutiny. The Ford plant received an alternative line of credit from a consortium of smaller investors who had less appetite for spectacle and more for stability. Companies that would not ask for personal concessions and who could not afford the headline risk that had burst into Jasper's careful playbook. The deal was messy, not generous, but it was enough to keep the plant's doors open. It came with conditions that require transparency, audits, oversight, and public statements that did not hinge on Luna's private life. Jasper's influence was dented but not broken. Men in black did not immediately vanish from the city's shadowed streets. They slid back into anonymity. Rumors persisted. Legal threats were lobbed like grenades in the public sphere. But the pressure to keep Luna's name confined had weakened. That weakening gave her room to breathe. There were other costs. Chloe's reputation continued to teeter. Opportunists called her motives into question, and private messages threatened exposure. For a while, there were ugly nights when Luna would wake with the taste of metal and feel the brittle echo of public shame. She began, slowly, to reclaim the stories she wanted to keep. Small dinners with friends, afternoons fixing a broken radio with Leo, conversations with Ethan about future plans for the plant that were not just about profit, but about dignity for workers. She learned, with Jason's help, to shape the past into something that did not own her. Yet memory, once it begins to return, is not merely consolation, it is also a demand for reckoning. In one session with Jason, Luna relived the short, sharp scene that had been lodged like debris in the back of her mind. A darkened room lit by a single bulb, the edge of a chair, the smell of someone's aftershave, and then the command to be quiet. She felt again, not the physical weight, but the way her voice had been minimized by the presence of intimidation. The recollection came with faces, anonymous enough to be frustrating, specific enough to be dangerous. She remembered the voice of a man who had been polite in business emails, but whose tone in that room was the exact opposite. When she told the story, Jason did not overreact. He suggested possible steps. Report what she recalled to the police and provide them with the collected evidence. Seek protective orders if she feared for her safety. Press for civil action. Legal counsel on their side, someone who had been quiet until pushed, took the notes and prepared subpoenas. The aim was not vengeance, it was protection and accountability. The legal path exposed more of Jasper's associates than anyone expected. A service provider who had once accepted payments for sound editing admitted that he had been paid through a chain of invoices that had been approved by a member of Jasper's office. Another witness, a driver who had once transported people between venues, confessed he had been asked to reroute on a particular night. Most accounts were not clean lines of criminal intent. They were men and women performing tasks they had been paid to perform, a bureaucracy of complicity rather than a cinematic network. But even bureaucracy, when stitched with deliberate acts, can cause real harm. Faced with potential subpoenas and reputational fallout, Jasper made moves that were equal parts charm and coercion. He apologized in public forums, statements that began with sorrow and ended with the careful caveat of legal counsel. He leaned into private gestures that had become a pattern. Sudden bouquets of white roses, invitations to dinner where he would be achingly vulnerable for the cameras. He was, in ways that unsettled Luna, sometimes genuinely regretful. There were faces he could not always fake. Yet his control mechanisms remained. Offers of money, implicit threats wrapped as pragmatic choices. The world is rarely divided into purely good and purely evil. Jasper embodied that tension. He was not a cartoon villain. He was a man who had made choices that benefited his empire. The people who benefited from that system, employees at his firm, family members who relied on the connections, could hardly be expected to be enthusiastic about his ruin. The moral economy of his wrongdoing was complicated by the livelihoods that intersected with his decisions. The story of Luna's recovery was not only public, it became a test of the people around her. Leo's parents, who had been cautious at the start, came to see Leo's loyalty as something less naive and more principled. Mrs. Bennett called Luna and apologized for the pressure she had exerted earlier. "We were frightened for him," she said frankly, "but he's made his choice, and I see now it was the right one." When the medical bill stabilized and Ethan regained strength enough to begin light work at the plant, Luna felt a shift in momentum. Her decisions had helped prevent the worst of the financial storm. And yet, she could not shake the feeling that some part of her life had been purchased with terms she had not consented to. She vowed to change that. The emotional climax of the saga arrived not in a courtroom nor in a tabloid splash, but on a quiet, public stage, a small charity gala intended to raise funds for workers' retraining, an event with cameras but not the fever of a wedding. It was the kind of place where you expected good intentions to be packaged with cocktails. Luna had been invited as a speaker. The organizers, mindful of press, had prepared a discreet platform. Jasper appeared as well, in a tux that fit him like a second skin. His smile was impeccable. People in the room watched for sparks. Luna took the stage to speak about dignity and labor. Her speech began carefully, a measured tribute to the workers and to the need for honest leadership. She spoke about the plant as if reciting the names of small, lovely things, a pedantry that was not small at all. Her voice was steady. The therapy had taught her to control it. Halfway through, she did something no one expected. She asked the stage manager to play a short clip, an excerpt of the raw audio that had been the hinge of their case. followed by the testimony of the tech who had come forward. Her request was not designed to humiliate. It was designed to force an acknowledgement of truth in a public place where people cannot simply let the story pass like a tabloid. Luna wanted the truth to be heard where it had once been shaped into a weapon. The clip played. The room held its breath. There was an awkward silence afterwards. Some people fidgeted, others watched Jasper. He smiled, at first, and then the smile tightened. He rose as Luna finished speaking and approached her at the edge of the stage. Cameras leaned forward, capturing every tilt of expression. "You should not have done that," he whispered, proximity making it intimate and cruel. "You've complicated everything." She met his eyes. The crowd could not hear them, but it did not need to. Her standing there, choosing to play the truth, was a declaration in itself. "No," she said, "I should have done it a long time ago." Their exchange spilled into the lobby, where a cluster of photographers had gathered. Jasper made an offer still framed as a kindness. Quiet settlements, donations, a public apology. In return, he wanted a meeting in private with Luna. He framed it as a chance to make things right. She agreed, but she did not go alone. Leo came with her, as did a lawyer who had been quiet until pushed. Chloe accompanied them, smaller and steadier. The meeting was in a high-ceilinged room with a view that made people feel grand. Jasper sat across the table, the light catching the plane of his cheek, his voice soft with the practiced inflection of a man used to giving people options that were never quite options. "I can offer you a clean exit," he said. "We can finalize divorce papers. We can frame this as a mutual decision driven by your health and your family's best interest. In return, I ask only that you do not pursue the humiliation beyond what is necessary." Luna listened. She imagined signing her name and watching the plant keep its lights on. She imagined the exhale that might come with an end that allowed others to sleep comfortably again. But she also imagined the cost, the slow erasure of what she had been through, the letting go of the right to name the wrongs done to her. "Why would I trust you?" she asked. He leaned forward, hands flat on the table as if crossing a threshold. "Because I love you," he said, and the words sat in the space between them, complicated and dangerous. The claim was more complicated than truth or lie. People often say love when power is the true thing on offer. Luna looked at him for a long time. She thought of the airplane model that had rested on her bedside and of Leo's steady voice. She thought of Ethan's face when he'd smiled and told her he wanted to work toward a safer plant. She thought of Chloe and how quickly a person can be thrown aside when they are no longer useful. She thought of the men in suits, the invoices, the small acts of intimidation that had left bruises not only on her body but in the bank accounts of her sense of self. "I can't," she said finally. "I won't trade my truth for silence. I won't be the person who gives up her story because it makes someone else comfortable." There was a silence, like glass breaking. Jasper's face shifted. He conditioned himself into a different posture, calm, rational, threatening without shouting. "Then you force my hand," he said, "and I will not lose what I have built because of a personal grievance." "You will not force anyone's hand," Leo interjected, "not here." The lawyer suggested another path, a divorce that left Luna free but with secure funding for the plant that did not tie her personal life to the company's stability, terms that would be enforced through trusts and public oversight. It was a hard bargain, but it protected the people who depended on the Ford plant without making Luna into collateral. Jasper considered. The man who loved control was learning that some things could no longer be controlled easily. Public scrutiny had turned into a practical liability. He agreed, by the end of the day, to terms that protected the plants and removed personal conditions, though he made it clear, with the faint doggedness of men who do not easily relinquish, that his pride was wounded. The legal agreement was precise. It provided for a substantial financial infusion to stabilize the plant, but bound the funding through independent trustees. It removed any clauses that stipulated Luna's personal behavior or marital status as a condition. It ended the idea of bargaining her name for payrolls. The victory felt, in certain moments, like something that had been negotiated in the currency of pain. She had to relive things, confront people, and risk more humiliation to secure a practical outcome. It was hardly clean, but the plant's lights remained on. Jasper wrote a public statement that read like reconciliation. He said his slip of the tongue had been an unfortunate moment exaggerated by a cruel world. The press called it a misstep. Some of the old allies of the elite sighed and declared their loyalty to stability. The tabloids moved on because outrage migrates fast. Luna's choice at the end of the negotiation was not a surrender, but a selection. She declined to remain married. The decision was hers. The decision was hers. Divorce papers were signed in a small attorney's office, not at a glittering table. There were no dramatic arrests or vanishings. There were instead quiet transactions of signatures, tepid apologies, and legalese that promised oversight and protection. Jasper's final face in the crossing of signatures was not full of villainy, but of a man who had been bested at a game he taught himself to win. He left afterward with a suit that looked oddly empty. There were no fireworks. There were perhaps consequences that would make his ascent slower and his control less total. The men in black withdrew their obvious presence, and in their place, rumors ebbed and flowed like a receding tide. Luna's path forward was not tidy. She had to rebuild her relationships with those she loved and those she had felt forced to distance. She had to reconcile the person who had loved Jasper with the person who now sought new ground. That reconciliation did not require a return to the old memories. Instead, it required that she lay claim to the memories she wanted and turn away from those that had been weaponized against her. Leo steadied beside her in those months. He did not make grand proclamations. He offered a consistent, companionable presence. Coffee at dawn, an airplane model polished to a shine that they placed on Ethan's hospital bedside as a marker of future travel. Small, practical things that stitched life together. He asked for nothing she did not freely give. He loved her not by possession, but by presence. Chloe's life shifted too. With Luna's support and the attention of the public on the manipulation rather than the gossip, she found work that did not require her to bend in the exact ways she had before. She enrolled in a community college program and learned bookkeeping. Her reputation did not return to spotless, but it rebalanced into a life that was less about being a scapegoat and more about being someone who could approximate a future. Ethan returned to work in a managerial role that allowed him to oversee safety. His accident had changed the plant's culture. He pushed for training reforms and worker safety initiatives that made the plant more resilient and less likely to fall into the ragged hands of spectacle. The city did what cities do. It moved on. But some things had changed under the surface. Luna had stopped being available as a symbol. She had become, instead, a person who could insist on a life with its own definitions. She had reclaimed her name the way a gardener reclaims a field from weeds, patient, obstinate, deliberate. There came a day when she stood at the window of an apartment that had been hers and no one else's, a small place with a view of roofs and distant highways, and held the airplane model in her hand. The metal was warm from her palm. Leo stood behind her, fingers brushing the small of her back in a movement that had nothing to do with power. Around them, the small domesticities of their life hummed softly. A radio that sometimes needed repair, a kettle that liked to sputter, a neighbor who left them an extra lemon tart on a Tuesday. "You ready?" Leo asked gently. "For what?" she answered, because the question was about more than travel. "For the meeting with the trustees," he said. "For the plant's official reopening, for all the things we thought might be impossible." She smiled. There was a weight in the smile. Years, perhaps, of being named by others, of being told who she was. Now, a different sound echoed, her name in her voice. There was grief for what had been lost, of course. Memory returned in shards, the softness of Jasper's presence in private, the way he had once made her laugh, the times when she had believed his promises. Those memories sat on the same shelf as new ones, the quiet tenderness of Leo's midnight repairs, Ethan's stubborn, optimistic plans, Chloe's newfound focus. On the day the plant reopened, a wing dedicated to worker safety, a small ceremony was held. Luna spoke about resilience and about the danger of letting other people determine your worth. It was a short speech. She did not use the stage to avenge herself. Instead, she turned the language toward practicalities and to the people whose work kept the city alive. After the ceremony, as employees filed past to shake hands, someone pressed a small envelope into her palm. She opened it later in the quiet. Inside was a ticket, an old-fashioned boarding pass pinned to a note, "For when you are ready." No signature, just a promise from an unnamed friend who believed in flight. She thought of burning the wedding invitation she had kept as a curiosity. Instead, she took it down to the river and, under an honest gray sky, folded it twice and let the water take it. It floated like a small white negotiation and then vanished. In the weeks that followed, Luna and Leo planned small departures, weekend trips that were small declarations of possibility. They did not plan a grand honeymoon or an extravagant escape. Their flights were modest, a couple of days to the coast, a ferry to an island where the air tasted like open things. They saved money like people who plan for improbable futures, careful, steady, deliberate. The night before the first trip, Luna sat on the small balcony with the airplane model in one hand and a cup of tea that had gone cold. She thought of the people who had tried to name her, what they had intended and what had come to pass. She had not regained every memory, nor did she need to. The central truth, she had learned, was not the completeness of memory, but the ability to choose what to do with what returned. Love, she had discovered, was not a transaction. It was a commitment to be present without possession. "Are you scared?" Leo asked from behind her, voice low as the city hummed. "A little," she admitted, "but I think the fear now is honest." "So is mine," he said. "But I can live with honest fear beside honest hope." She set the airplane model beside her on the balcony rail and watched the city glow. In the distance, an airplane traced a tiny line across the night sky, an accidental, luminous reminder that flight was not forbidden. It was simply an act of leaving and returning. When she boarded the tiny plane the next morning, she did not look back with regret. She did not need to. The act of leaving was not an escape from the past, but a movement toward a future she had not yet named. Leo held her hand in the aisle as the engines pulled them forward. The small wings on his lap brushed the seat as people settled into their quiet lives. Luna closed her eyes and felt the vibration underfoot. As the plane lifted, the city beneath them went soft, then small. She thought of the wounds that had made her wise, the manipulations that had taught her how to hold her ground, and the people who had stood beside her through the slow demolition of a public lie. She thought of Jasper, no longer a story that could name her. She thought of Chloe, learning arithmetic. She thought of Ethan, planning safety protocols. She thought of the airplane model on the nightstand at home, left like a signal for the future. The flight was short and bracing. Somewhere above a cloud bank, Leo squeezed her hand and whispered, "We're going somewhere new." She smiled, feeling, for the first time in a long while, the tug of a genuine possibility. She had been called by another name and had come back to claim her own. The memory of those 5 years would return in pieces, sometimes painful, sometimes soft. But the choice belonged to her now. The plane crossed a thin band of sunlight, and then the sky opened. The next chapter of her life was not a blank ledger to be written by someone else. It was a page she held in her own hands. And as the island itself rose out of the blue below them, then the gentle dip toward a new shore, Luna felt the steady, quiet power of a person who had remembered to keep her name. If you want to see what happens next, alternate endings, deeper dives into Jasper's consequences, or how Luna rebuilds the company, watch part 2 of this series and follow the playlist for the alternate ending episodes.